This e-bike has completely changed how I look at the concept of bugging out, because when you take this 75-pound monster and deploy it with a little bit of purpose and intention, she's going to get you out of town with a quickness. At home on the trails or the streets, she runs fast and silent. Consider the e-bike to be, in my mind, the perfect middle ground between rocking on foot, which we know sucks, and driving your POV. Now, to be 100% clear, the e-bike is not perfect. So today we're looking at the pros and cons of the Pucky Puppy Labrador. Yeah, I know, say that 3 times fast. We're gonna check out the specs on this e-bike, and we're also going to LARP as a 10th century Viking warrior. Now, ideally, I never have to bug out. That is literally the worst case scenario. That is the E for emergency in the PACE acronym. So yeah, that's the big problem we're faced with here. You gotta escape, you gotta get out of Dodge, you gotta make this happen fast, you gotta carry the mission essential gear, and you need to absolutely be low profile in that process. So how do we go about handling this issue? Because if we can't drive our POV for whatever reasons, let's say we don't have gas or maybe the roads are closed, I guess we're rucking on foot, which just sucks, let's be honest. So with those options off the table, obviously a little bit of two-wheel action makes a lot of good sense because it's a lot better than rucking on foot. But the only problem is if you don't have a battery like this e-bike has, you're the battery. And I did an entire video on this back in October 2023 with my Rocky mountain bike, had it all loaded out, and it was a lot of fun. But I can tell you what, you're going to burn up a lot of calories in that process, and you're not going to be able to really go maybe as fast as you would want to go or could possibly go if you had an e-bike. And unironically enough, in that October 2023 video, I kind of dissed on the e-bike a little bit.
Then I found out they weigh like 40 pounds, the battery life sucks, and nobody wants to get stuck pushing a bike up a hill or moving over obstacles that weighs like 40 pounds. Oh yeah, the price tag wasn't exactly too nice either. So,
but now that I put almost 100 miles on this bike, I've had a little bit of a change of heart. I mean, I don't know quite how to put it into words, but this change of heart might have had something to do with the fact this bike is just fun as hell to ride. It is just a blast. And as my 11-year-old says, it cooks. I mean, it's at home in any environment. Dirt, single track, double track, sand, pavement, it just goes. It's fast, it's silent, and it's just a blast to ride. And in the process of researching this bike, riding this bike, and building this little loadout I got going on here, I found out the e-bikes are being leveraged right now in the Russo-Ukrainian war. So I figure, listen, if it's good enough for the boys in World War III, I guess it could be good enough for me. So LARPing as a Viking. I feel like this works because I have the sword and I have my trusty steed. So what else do I need? The sword is absolutely amazing. It is just, whew, it's nice. Not gonna lie. It just feels necessary.
I pick up my sword. I am the commander of this house. I decide if there's a contagion. I decide what I do. Be quiet.
Now I can just imagine myself on my trusty steed, hacking down my enemies and my foes. But if I'm being honest, maybe it's a little impractical. I don't know, you let me know. I mean, really, when it comes down to it, I think this loadout is way better. So yeah, that's definitely more practical. But to be honest, I still love the sword. Anyways, let's get back into it. Let's go ahead and talk advantages of the e-bike. And first and foremost, obviously, it's basically totally silent. I mean, aside from the low hum of the motor, you're not going to hear anything, which is a huge advantage. Secondly, it's fast. Loaded out with the backpack and the little bags I have on here, on dirt trails, I easily hit 10, 15 plus miles an hour. No problem at all. My battery just stays nice and juiced up. I can hit 20 very easily. And then on made roads or pavement or where it's super, super flat and smooth, I can easily hit up to 30 miles an hour on this bike, which is absolutely amazing. It's fast, it's silent, and hey, I don't even need gasoline for it. So hey, that's a huge bonus. Now, the other thing to figure here that I just kind of touched on was load bearing capability. It maxes out at 400 plus pounds. Now, I'm going to assume that 400 pounds includes myself, right? So if I include my weight, which is about 170 pounds, plus 50 to 60 pound backpack, plus maybe about 20 pounds distributed between these bags, I'm easily under that 400 pound mark. Now, obviously, I can add a rack up front. I can add on a rack on the back, but it's very important to mention that with a full suspension bike, your options for rear mounted racks are very limited and kind of costly. So just keep that in mind when you're scoping out full suspension mountain bikes. But yeah, overall, I can move a lot of weight. I can tow a lot of weight with a trailer. There's just a lot of advantages to that. And being battery powered, I'm not going to expend a ton more energy carrying this extra weight. Another advantage that we have here is the fact that the batteries are swappable or interchangeable. So if I wanted to get more range out of a battery, I could just carry an extra battery with me. It pops right out of the frame, put another one in, and I'm good to go. Now, of course, that does add a little extra weight and maybe decreases that battery life a little bit. So you know what, let's touch on that real quick. So talking batteries, max range on this is about 40 to 80 miles, depending on the conditions, the terrain, and obviously how fast you're riding this bike, and obviously how much weight you're transporting. For me, I'm getting about 40 to 50 miles, averaging about 15 miles an hour with the gear loadout that I just discussed. So that's not bad at all. Now, let's go ahead and talk about another detail of this bike that is actually pretty cool, and that is just overall the ride of a fat tire full suspension mountain bike. It is super comfortable. These fat tires obviously perform great in dirt, sand, and pretty much any type of off-road type of environment that you might consider when you are trying to get out of town, low profile and fast. Maybe you're not driving down I-95 or some major interstate on your e-bike. And then another factor that you got to take into account with the e-bike, and I definitely consider this to be an advantage, is the fact that it is fielded live right now in the Russo-Ukrainian War. And so I figure if it's good enough for the boys in World War III, it's probably good enough for me. Now, that's not to say you would want to blindly copy and paste what the military does just because it works for the military. Because the boys over there, you know, they're using these bikes for reconnaissance operations. They're using them for shoot and scoot. Obviously, there's advantages to having an e-bike because it's not loud like a motorcycle. Maybe it doesn't have as much of a thermal signature as a motorcycle would as well. But the thing is they have the capability to recharge these, right? They still have the infrastructure in place. So that makes the e-bike a lot better of a long-term option, right? So keeping that in mind as a dirty, nasty civilian, I have to consider the fact that, yeah, I might not have that infrastructure in place. And I see the bike right now, if I just think about not being able to recharge it, as a great one-way mode of transport. It gets me from point A to point B, which is my bug out location or my shelter site or whatever the case is, right? And when considered in that role, makes perfect sense. And hey, like I said, maybe I'll throw another battery in there. Let's have a reality check about e-bikes. The biggest advantage is also the biggest disadvantage, and that's the fact that it is electrical. There's a battery. It weighs a ton, 75 pounds. So can you operate this bike when the battery is dead? Absolutely. But imagine just manually pedaling a 75-pound bike. For me here in Florida, it's not a big deal. Flat terrain, very forgiving. Maybe in a different environment, not so good. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're operating the vehicle. And the best thing you can do, obviously, is just stay within your range and conserve your battery and don't max out your speed, right? So that brings me to the second point here. The second disadvantage to an e-bike is the fact that since it's an e-bike, it's going to be a little more complicated than your traditional bike. So more complicated, more parts, and more room for failure. Third disadvantage is maneuverability. It's 75 pounds, got all these big fat tires. It's not exactly nimble. Here's another point that I guess could be a disadvantage to an e-bike is that most e-bikes are not street legal, meaning they can't be operated on your normal roads and highways. So that is a disadvantage. More expensive e-bikes can absolutely do that from what I understand, but generally speaking, that might limit your range and your mode of transport. Now, of course, if it's a bug out situation, a no rule law, or whatever the case is, you know, maybe who cares, right? And then the other point to mention here is the fact that the recharge time takes forever. I have to plug this thing in overnight to fully recharge it. And you really, honestly, you never want this thing to drain fully out. You always would prefer, ideally, in order to maintain the health of the battery and the recharge time and longevity, you would only really want this battery to get down to maybe 50% and then recharge it. Okay, let's look at the specs real quick for the Pucky Puppy Labrador. And honestly, guys, I can't tell you how many times I've had to reshoot this because I'm having a hard time saying Pucky Puppy, but let's get into it. Starting with the battery, we have a 48-volt battery here, which is good for 40 to 80 miles, depending on how you have the bike loaded out, about how fast you drive. It's stored in the frame, and as I mentioned earlier, it is interchangeable. We have a 750-watt hub motor. We got big fat old tires, which are great on sand and dirt. This bike is dual suspension, which obviously improves handling and just the overall ride quality. The Pucky Puppy also has powerful disc brakes, which is kind of important when you're toting a bunch of weight and rolling along at 20 plus miles an hour down a trail. We're also going to look around here a little bit, and you're going to see lots of Shimano components. You know, these are not the super high grade, high end Shimano components, but they're reliable. And then there's a gas pedal here, which is super cool. And then we have a 7-speed tranny, super crisp shifting for adjusting resistance and speed. And then really what makes this bike an e-bike and makes it worthwhile is the fact that it sports pedal assist, right? So it has 5 different pedal assist levels with a max top speed of 33 miles an hour. At least that's what I tested, fully unloaded, no backpack, on pavement. The e-bike can be a great bug out vehicle, but you definitely want to use some common sense, a little bit of purpose and intention when you think about how you're going to leverage this in a survival situation. Now, for me personally, I look at this as a one-shot transport option, right? Because in a bug out situation, my goal is to get from point A to point B. And that's about 50 miles using side roads and all that kind of good stuff and dirt tracks. So my route is fine. My range is fine. And the only thing that I can't count on is the ability to recharge this battery. So that's why this is kind of like a one-shot option. It's going to get me from point A to point B. If I can recharge my battery, then cool. Maybe I do something else. But for now, it's just a fast, silent, and very effective way to get me away from danger as fast as possible, utilizing side roads, tracks, and trails, and all that kind of good stuff, and staying super low profile in the process. A second and obvious use for the e-bike would be as a reconnaissance tool in your area of operations. And of course, that is assuming you have some way to recharge the bike. But man, if you do, what a great tool, right? So obviously, first and foremost, reconnaissance, maybe you pair it with a drone, and that's just an awesome asset to have. Secondly, let's say you need to get into an area and scavenge for some supplies and get back out with a quickness. There's another option. Maybe you need to get in there and be like some sort of Delta Force team space ninja and shoot and scoot and do stuff that cool operators do. I don't know what they do because I'm not an operator, but you get the general idea, right? The e-bike, if you have the infrastructure, man, it can just be an overall amazing asset for tons of different uses in a survival situation. Which of course reminds me of how this bike is being leveraged in the Ukraine war. And I just want to point out one detail about that is that these bikes that you see are much more expensive than this one. Now, if we're talking price, right, let's talk about, is this really a good investment of your money, right? Because your money is time and all that kind of good stuff. Well, honestly, guys, I got this bike, when was it? It was back in May. The price has already dropped $500. E-bikes are getting cheaper and cheaper and more powerful by the day. So as an investment, as a potential bug out vehicle, or just a fun vehicle to ride recreationally, man, I can't really honestly say enough good things about the Pucky Puppy Labrador. So big shout out to the crew at Pucky Puppy Labrador for reaching out to me, for offering me this bike for review. I absolutely love it. And overall, it really did change my perspective on e-bikes. Now, that's not to say I'm going to get rid of my Rocky Mountain bike, but for now, this is my primary bug out vehicle. If I can't drive, and Lord knows, nobody wants to throw a 60-pound pack on and hike 20, 30 miles on foot in the Florida heat. That just sucks. So why make your life suck even worse when you got something like this that can get you there fast, silent, and having a lot of fun along the way?